Dropping, another very important book of Professor Kuusisto. It is about the memoir of the blindness and listening and the importance of listening, really. Also, he's a poet who's written a book on poetry, Only Bread, Only Light, and Letters to Borges, who's also been, was also a traveler, and he, I think, writes in memory of him. He's been an Iowa writer, graduate of the Iowa Writing Workshop, a Fulbright Fellow. He's also taught at University of Iowa, Hobart, and William Smith College, and Ohio State University College, again. State University, rather, not college, sorry. He currently teaches in Syracuse University, where he holds a professor's post in the Department of Center on Human Policy, Law and Disability Studies. Today, he's also, sorry, before I go to his title for the day, he's also someone who frequently talks about disability all around US and other places in the world. His website, for anyone who wants to read more on him, stephenkuusisto.com. So today, Steve is going to talk to us about blind travel, performance, and the proleptic imagination, something that I've read about in his book and also on his blog. So proleptic imagination, blind travel, performance, and proleptic imagination. Over to you, Professor Steve Kuusisto.
Oh, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. I am going to talk a little slowly so that the sign language interpreter can really pick up on what I'm doing. So I think everyone who has a disability can relate to what I'm going to talk about today, which is that when you're traveling in the world as a disabled person, you are visible to those who are not disabled, and a complex series of often unspoken and then sometimes spoken engagements happens, because disability in non-disabled spaces is a kind of strange performance. So here we go. I worry some days about my reputation for as a disability activist and writer who must contend with many varieties of ableism, and in turn feels always obliged to draw attention to the same, whether discriminatory behavior is directed at groups, individuals, or myself. I am confronted with hardened rhetorical choices. And as we say in the vernacular, that ain't easy street. That was a hard sentence to do for sign language. It ain't easy street because normalizing practices in speech tend toward the elimination of complexity. And what is disability after all but complexity? Disability is the ear inside the ear, wildly perceptive and inapparent on the common street. That's how it is. That deaf woman, that wheelchair man, the blind walker, all are more imaginative than we may know, or normally will admit. Those of us in the disability studies area talk about disabilities as ways of knowing, precisely because, as rhetorician J. Dolmaj notes, we understand imperfect, extraordinary, non-normative bodies as the origin and epistemological homes of all meaning making. Imperfect and extraordinary are not of or pertaining to custom in Western thought. Though, as Dolmaj demonstrates in his wonderful book, Disability Rhetoric, one may peel back the layers of storytelling and find examples of disability as a generative principle. Or as the writer Kurt Vonnegut once said, and here I'm paraphrasing, a story is interesting if a nun has broken dental floss trapped between her teeth. Vague or overt discomfort generates all stories. But disability is less of plot and more of imagination when we admit difficulty. Precisely because it isn't easy, disability is evocative. Precisely because it isn't easy, disability is contentious to the body politic, which always hopes to ignore or sidestep disability perspectives in favor of limiting narratives. Whether we're talking about a bad novel with a forlorn disabled character or an educational assessment for a student, making disability easy is to not admit it into either a theoretical or practical arena. Who among us disabled hasn't been pressured in many a circumstance to say disability is easy? Oh, it's nothing, we say, because the literal daily experience of disability both inconveniences normal thinking, and because we feel always the demand to project overcoming, which in terms of narrative is always easy. You kiss the prince, pull the brass ring, you go home richer. Confronted with hardened rhetorical choices, that's the effect of easy, for the compulsion to say disability is just nothing is immense, especially in employment settings where difficulty of any kind is largely considered inadmissible. The disabled assume a spoiled identity. If you must highlight failures of access or accommodation at your workplace, if you do it frequently, you will likely be cemented into the overshoes of the bad cripple, to borrow the wonderful name of the late William Peace's blog, The Bad Cripple. In my case, I've irritated college administrators for years by insisting that websites or auditoriums or community events aren't accessible. The pressure is to make this sound easy. And though accessibility should always be easy when factored into planning, it's never simple when inaccessible choices have already been made. Software is adopted that's not accessible. Buildings are renovated badly. One speaks up. One is invariably a pest. Being a disability activist is never easy street. And I wonder some days if I'll ever live to see a truly inclusive village. This brings me back to my opening. In disability land, hope is a hardened choice. What story shall we tell? Is it advisable to give away our essential difference, our complications, our needs, to assure easy interpersonal communications with human resources personnel or various bosses? It is a hardened story as well as a hard one. To tell it right, we must tell it hardened. And telling it hardened means, as disability scholar Brenda Brueggemann would say, telling it with insight. There is pressure here. I'm not selling you a sofa and love seat, so plush with all new seasonal colors. In fact, I'm not selling you a thing. Inclusion and human rights are always difficult precisely because they evade simple custom. I remember how years ago, I entered a restaurant in New York City only to leave, only to be told I should leave because I had a guide dog. Explanations ensued. Guide dog, legally required to admit. Police summoned. Police explain. Restaurant owner angry. I try to make nice, smile and say kind things. Say things like, you watch, this is a wonderful dog. She'll go straight under the table. You'll never know she's here. Smiling and smiling, trying to save face really, because after being admitted, how should I leave? You can't. You're making a disability rights point. Leaving is failure. Staying is complicated. You will endure a lousy social setting. You will eat without appetite. The meal lies before you and you hesitate halfway between eating and running. You pat your dog under the table. In turn, your aim is to educate the public and to do so by being right here. And so your very body is a story. Your body is oppositional. Over time, I've come to think of Sigmund Freud's analysis of the three caskets as it may pertain to disability rhetoric. Freud wrote, two scenes from Shakespeare, one from a comedy and the other from a tragedy, have lately given me occasion for posing and solving a small problem. This is still Freud. The first of these scenes is the suitor's choice between the three caskets in The Merchant of Venice. The fair and wise Portia is bound at her father's bidding to take as her husband only that one of her suitors who chooses the right casket from among the three before him. The three caskets are of gold, silver, and lead. The right casket is the one that contains her portrait. Two suitors have already departed unsuccessful. They have chosen gold and silver. Bassanio The third decides in favor of lead. Thereby he wins the bride, whose affection was already his before the trial of fortune. Each of the suitors gives reasons for his choice in a speech in which he praises the metal he prefers and depreciates the other two. The most difficult task thus falls to the share of the fortunate third suitor. What he finds to say in glorification of lead as against gold and silver is little and has a forced ring. If in psychoanalytic practice we were confronted with such a speech, we should suspect that there were concealed motives behind the unsatisfying reasons produced. Now, this is me. Freud goes on to suggest the three caskets represent women's bodies. Freud being Freud, right? But what matters, I think, is the glorification of lead and the fortunate third suitor. Disability rhetoric must always convey a forced ring, for preferring lead to gold suggests to the normal people something, if not quite concealing, certainly unsatisfying. Who would choose to be blind? Who chooses to have a wheelchair? Isn't all disability simply lead? You who say you've a brand of imaginative intelligence, you must be fooling. Isn't disability, when considered rhetorically alongside gold or silver, more than unsatisfying? Isn't it vaguely dishonest with concealed motives? Isn't it dark? The lead casket in The Merchant of Venice bears an inscription on its lid. Quote, "Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath." By Shakespeare's time, hazard was understood to mean chance of loss, or as a noun, it meant an unfortunate card. Such is the dominant appreciation of disability. A bad draw. But to hazard at lead is illustrative of doubling misfortune, to play a steeper gamble, to bet everything on a third-class chance or ticket. Hope is a hardened choice. Let us assume blindness is never static and always takes its meaning in phenomenological terms from movement. Right? What's the one thing non-blind people say? How can you go anywhere if you can't see, right? Blindness takes its meaning in phenomenological terms from movement. Let us describe blindness as proleptic imagination. Proleptic. In rhetoric, the anticipation of possible objections in order to answer them in advance. I have to insert here, all disabled know this. The anticipation of possible objections in order to answer them in advance. Traveling blind is a performance, both within normative subventions of assistance and outside cultural denotations of helplessness. Blind travel, taken as performance, is proleptic, both anticipating and answering implicit objections to the concept of blind independence in the very process of navigation. In the restaurant that doesn't want me, I'm an inscription. It says on the lid of my casket, I doubled misfortune by moving. I transformed you who saw me by my very presence. Hazard is hope. Hope is hazard. Motion is script. Moreover, it's lyric writing. By writing, we discover our subject. Lyric discovery means disability was never what was thought, was always static, was always moving both physically and in the mind. Let's be clear, lyric imagination is never helpless. It's incapable of dishonesty. Its every discovery is just that, a pure finding. In my recent collection of poems, Letters to Borges, I wrote a series of poems addressed to the Argentine poet whose blindness prevented him from traveling freely. George Luis Borges was never taught the techniques of independent mobility and lived his life with a constant sighted escort. Accordingly, he never enjoyed the experience of lone blind travel with all its myriad strangenesses, hazards, and lyric discoveries. Throughout the book, I send him my proleptic poems or lyric postcards. Each is written from a location where I'm a stranger and where I've managed to get lost. Getting lost is understood to be an artful experience, a hazard with many possibilities. So here's a poem called Letter to Borges from Galway in Ireland. I go out in the early morning rain and tap the cobblestones with my stick. On my left, there is a river. On my right, a loose window makes funereal percussions. Songs of earth, I think. I am not unique. I stand beneath the shutter and weep. I love this world. I am alone in a new city. If I died here beside the river and the window, maybe everything I've known would make sense in the gray of an Irish minute. Goodbye to the peregrine falcons, I think. Goodbye to the glass of water that contains a single daylily. Farewell to Mahler on the radio late at night. Don't get me wrong, I get lost in cities every week. I have learned much by following the whims of architects The whims of architects, steep facts, obstructions certainly, but perfect in their way. One takes detours, finds well lost a simultaneity of imaginings. Poets famously walk poems into being. Blind poets also. Blind surprise is lyric surprise, unplanned, not premeditated, perfectly unforeseeable, which is, of course, a concomitant amusement of blind travel. I shall double down on the bad card, the paltry wager of disablement. In his introduction to phenomenology, Robert Sokolowski notes that where phenomenology is concerned, quote, there are no mere appearances and nothing is just an appearance. Appearances are real. They belong to being. Things do show up. Phenomenology allows us to recognize and to restore the world that seemed to have been lost when we were locked into our own internal world by philosophical confusions. Things that had been declared to be merely psychological are now found to be ontological, part of the being of things. Pictures, words, symbols, perceived objects, states of affairs, other minds, laws and social conventions are all acknowledged as truly there, as sharing in being, and as capable of appearing according to their own proper style. I love that quote. Ontology is, oddly enough, here mixing metaphors, a proper style. Lyric findings are constituent parts of being. Blind proleptic imagination anticipates surprise, refuting commonplace assumptions about disability as a leaden intelligence. This is the imagination hardened and yet buoyant, like the figurehead of a sailing ship. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, quote, the world in which a man lives shapes itself chiefly by the way in which he looks at it. And so it proves different to different men. To one it is barren, dull, and superficial. To another, rich, interesting, and full of meaning. On hearing of the interesting events which have happened in the course of a man's experience, many people will wish that similar things had happened in their lives too, completely forgetting that they should be envious rather of the mental aptitude which lent those events the significance they possess when he describes them. To a man of genius, they were interesting adventures. But to the dull perceptions of an ordinary individual, they would have been stale, everyday occurrences. This is in the highest degree the case with many of Goethe's and Byron's poems, which are obviously founded upon actual facts, where it is open to a foolish reader to envy the poet because so many delightful things happen to him, instead of envying that mighty power of fantasy, which was capable of turning a fairly common experience into something so great and beautiful. Thank you, Schopenhauer. Proleptic conception is movement and aptitude. It assumes shapes by driving ahead. It is not, however, simply freedom in the service of pleasure, that idea of the self as a noble enjoyer of its surroundings or its body. The traditional Enlightenment self is a free acquirer of sights, objects, tastes, sounds, and is understood to be a discerning tourist, a Thomas Jefferson in Paris, if you will. Speaking of the individual and his happiness, Schopenhauer says, here I go back to him, we have already seen in general that what a man is contributes much more to his happiness than what he has, or how he is regarded by others. What a man is, and so what he has in his own person, is always the chief thing to consider. For his individuality accompanies him always and everywhere, and gives its color to all his experiences. In every kind of enjoyment, for instance, the pleasure depends principally upon the man himself. Everyone admits this in regard to physical, and how much truer it is of intellectual pleasure. When we use that English expression to enjoy oneself, we are employing a very striking and appropriate phrase. For observe, one says, not he enjoys Paris, but he enjoys himself in Paris. To a man possessed of an ill-conditioned individuality, all pleasure is like delicate wine in a mouth made bitter with gall. Therefore, in the blessings as well as in the ills of life, less depends upon what befalls us than upon the way in which it is met. That is, upon the kind and degree of our general susceptibility. What a man is and has in himself, in a word, personality, and with all that it entails, is the only immediate and direct factor in his happiness and welfare. All else is mediate and indirect, and its influence can be neutralized and frustrated. But the influence of personality, never. This is why the envy, which personal qualities excite, is the most implacable of all. It is, as it is also the most carefully dissembled. Schopenhauer would not have understood the crippled tourist, for he would likely have understood the defective body as a general susceptibility to disappointment or a neutralized personality. If in our time we know disability as a matter of individuality and a directed intelligence, it's precisely because we are aware of the incorporeality of symbolism. Whether we're talking of George Trakl or Wallace Stevens, Trakl writes, he was the German expressionist poet, right? Trakl writes, I am a shadow far from darkening villages. I drank the silence of God out of the stream in the trees. I love that. I have to read that again. I am a shadow far from darkening villages. I drank the silence of God out of the stream in the trees. Wallace Stevens wrote, 20 men crossing a bridge into a village are 20 men crossing 20 bridges into 20 villages, or one man crossing a single bridge into a village. The world is entirely our acquaintanceship with shadows and unfixed forms. Hazarded imagining is nearly always providential. We find by indirection the particles of reverie. One may say this is true of all lyric poetry, but in the case of disability, the poetics is always a gamble. The doubling of the unlucky card. We play it twice. Blind wandering is aleatoric, like action painting, right? One thinks of Jackson Pollock. Action painting. Its discoveries are always impossible to have imagined before setting out, for there is no framing of the eye, no anticipation of sights, but merely a sequence of astonishments. One relays them back to the reader, much in the way a shaman tells a story of something discovered beyond the physical world, though in truth, the proleptic imagination is never overtly mystical. In poems, I seek to avoid Tiresias, the figure of blind, mystical sight. Traveling is felicitous and its own reward. Moreover, it's an incitement to creativity. So here's a little poem called Letter to Borges from Tampere, Finland. Winnowing and threshing in the far north, sunlight like tea in a glass, a stranger tells me. And local musicians play waltzes in a coffee bar. Borges, I got a bit drunk last night and walked into a field and lay down where the machines had torn a long seam in the earth. And waltzing was, as the Finns say, nurin kurin, all topsy-turvy in my head. And my ruined eyes took the roses and broken shards of twilight and built another village, a counter village, where the houses stood like wine glass stems. You could see through everything, even the walls of the church, a fact that didn't bother anyone, as men and women made of light are necessarily long-lived and unconcerned about the hour. The key word is unconcerned. Disablement is thought to be conditional and perilous. It is not. It is never what is supposed by whatever we mean by normal people. Proleptic poetry, anticipating the assumptions of normative culture, slips through the knot of diminishment, insists on slipping through. Here's a little poem, Letter to Borges from Dublin. The moon swims back and forth with insolence, no matter whether Ireland is rich or poor. Entire lives turn over. The old are young once again. The young break clean in the currents of stars. Borges, The moon combs dark paving stones. It follows the lines of streets. The light it casts is a poor man's fence. Can I say my faith is stirred? This light proclaims there is justice, and I can still make it out with these ruined eyes. As I said above, normalizing practices in speech tend to minimize complexity. The poem resists, and all blind walking resists. One speaks of hardened rhetorical choices and hardened walking because probative intelligence isn't leisure. Still, the hardening isn't without its tenderness, for the poem can admit many things at once. Letter to Borges from Graz. Tourists are fighting at a nearby table in this cafe close to the mountain. Something about losing their map or the tickets. My French isn't what it used to be. Borges, I recall your witty comment on the Falklands War. Britain and Argentina, quote, two bald men fighting over a comb, end quote. It was worse than that, of course. Thousands dead for an ink stain. Still, I like the morning, taking the lottery of streets as they come. No one should confuse aestheticism with sightlessness or blindness with desire. In general, meeting people is the antidote to errors of dissolution. I am trying to learn patience through tenderness. Disability is in the public square. It is openness, patience, and affection. One may say a loving kindness toward one's surroundings. I want to be kind. Even as I anticipate my rejection, I want to be kind. Prolepsis builds alternative architectures. The building materials are chance itself. So I'll close with this little poem, Letter to Borges from London. This is where an old woman sees me sitting alone in a park, just enjoying the sunshine, and thinks she needs to give me money. When I was a boy, I made a beehive from old letters, dark scraps from a trunk, lost loves, assurances from travelers. It was intricate work. I actually did this. I got old letters from a trunk in my grandmother's attic, and I made a beehive out of them. It was intricate work. The blind kid and the worker bee lost whole days. I made a library for inchworms. Now I'm a natural philosopher, but with the same restless hands. Some days I put cities together, Santiago and Carthage, Toronto and Damascus. If strangers watch closely, Borges, they'll see my fingers working at nothing. In Hyde Park, near the Albert Memorial, and alone on a bench, I reconstructed the boroughs of New York City. Brooklyn was at the center, Kyoto in place of Queens. This was a city of bells and gardens, a town for immigrants. The old woman passing by saw my hands at work. She thought I was a lost blind man, a fool, said, "Poor dearie," and gave me a quid. The third casket is the glorification of lead. Inside, it's never what it seems. So that's my formal talk. I hope it made sense. The ramblings of a poet.
Professor Kuusisto, it not only made sense, it actually, what I have been thinking while you've been speaking and reciting, is that without having used the three main words that this conference comprises of, you've actually traversed through all of them in many, many ways. The resistance, disruption, and transgression. That's what disability, by and large, is all about. And I guess through your poems, through your imagination, and the time that you have, traveled through, from Shakespeare to Schopenhauer and many, many phenomenologists, writers, thinkers. I think it's just amazing that how mind can also travel without necessarily taking the aeroplane. It's simply amazing, and I think we've all, had a great journey along with you while you were writing to Borges. We have also kind of learned how imagination can do wonders to the idea of traveling. And also, I mean, some of these things one also kind of relates to one's own life, being blind myself, that
Right.
how one has to be, very rightly said, proleptic about the idea of moving out of one's own comfort zone, one's own house, to even take take the first auto rickshaw, the bus or the train, and how many questions you have to answer before that.
Oh my God, I know, right?
How you're going to enter the station, how you're going to get to the door of the train, how you're going to step into
how do you use the bathroom?
Yeah, if you are going on a long distance train, how do you use the bathroom? So all of these things one has to imagine and answer even before one encounters it by one's own self.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So I completely, understand when you speak about this, and I've read it in your book as well. In the memoir on eavesdropping, that different expressions for different questions are always have to be ready. Otherwise, you can't kind of think of things beyond them. You have to respond at times without being interested in the question, because
right.
So I remember some of those incidences from your memoir as well. So I think one can go on talking about different parts of your talk, but I must say I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure all those who've been listening to you thoroughly enjoyed. So I think I should open up before I eat up on others' time. So I open up for questions. If anyone wants to ask, even by unmuting, just introduce yourself and you can ask your question even after unmuting. You could raise your hand so that if there are more than one, we could, Anurima could assist in, lining all of us together. And if there are questions in the chat box, Professor Steve, Anurima is with us, who will read it out.
Great.
And
hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Already a lot of comments over here.
Oh, good.
I think I'll just read out some of the comments, which, there's one comment from Swagata who says it was a mesmerizing listening experience. It was beautiful, and I so agree with her. And
Thank you. Thank you.
Mukul has written absolutely brilliant, a transgressive imagination. Loved the lecture. Thank you so much. And I think they speak for all of us over here. And there are some of these questions, so I'll just read them out. Krishna has asked, I have a question regarding your work titled Letters to Borges. I have read the book and found it exceedingly interesting and highly experimental. You have attempted to address Borges from across a large span of cities and locations to which you travel with your guide, Dog Corky. The questions relates to the choice of the genre, which is epistolary poetry. I would like to know the reason behind composing your work in verse rather than in prose. Is it a conscious choice because Borges saw himself primarily as a poet, although he wrote fiction too, and so you thought that addressing him in verse would be more intimate mode of communicating with him? And is it because of the fact that poetry demands caution in general that you do not interrogate Borges microscopically on the way he negotiated his life as a blind person, like the way Georgina Cleese does with Keller in the book Keller in her book Blind Rage: Letters to Helen Keller?
Yes.
Well, that's a long one. Yeah.
Oh, that's the most articulate, thoughtful, set of questions and comments. And, if I was being funny, I would just say, yes, because that was so smart. So I felt like I wanted to address Borges from the heart. And often when I write prose, I'm up in my head. I'm metaphorizing parts of the body, which we know we shouldn't do. But I wanted to say to Borges, look how interesting and strange these places are. Look how sometimes frightening, sometimes thrilling, sometimes ridiculous these various places are, right? When you're not being led around by a sighted person who's taking you from place to place as part of a pre-planned itinerary, but instead you're getting lost in Austria, well, lots of things happen that are emotional and unplanned. And so poetry seemed to me to be the way to convey this. When I write prose, I tend to organize it and make it tighter and, what's the word? Tidy, Poetry can be a little messy. And that's the experimental part that you noticed, that poetry can be a little unclear and make a virtue of it. Poetry can say, I remember one of the Borges poems ends with the line, sound of radios from the bread shop. It just ends in an odd place, right? So that's the thing you can do in poetry that in prose looks like a mistake. In poetry, it fits. And plus, I thought of all of these as little collages of reality, and then what that reality does to me on the inside, right? I feel sorry for Borges because he was really a great writer and a great poet, but he was led everywhere by sighted people, every moment. And so his life was scripted in this way. And I think in that way, he didn't experience the sort of strange surprise that independent disabled people can have.
The joy of being one's own self that you talked about.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. We do have a couple more questions in the chat box, but I also see Deepak Gupta, he's raised his hand. So I think I think it's better to just hear him ask his question first.
Yes,
Great.
Deepak, go ahead.
Hello, sir. It was indeed a very interesting and insightful talk, and I really enjoyed it, and enjoyed it being with you in this online conference, that are in a different kind of travel. So I was thinking on this line that yeah, I also being a visually impaired student here in IIT, and I do have passion to travel. And when I travel alone, there are a host of challenges, of course, questions and all, but there are also people who come forward to give a helping hand. And yet we have to negotiate many difficulties. And of course, and you have very brilliantly pointed out, the pleasant surprises come along. I went to many places with my visual impaired friends only, even alone, and we find that we imagine things, we imagine the place, and we
That's right.
imagine how we come to the place, and we do have some kind of conception of that place that may differ from the conceptions of those sighted people, but they are good for us. They are at least fantastic for us in our minds. And yes, we touch and we have senses, we have the sounds to figure out the place. And that reminds precisely of shadow lines, where Tridip says, places are all meant to be imagined. We imagine the place. Thank you, sir.
Well, and you know what else, right? Those are great comments, but it's also true that as with the poem in which I'm in Hyde Park in London, sometimes a stranger comes along and they make a kind of comedy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that woman who appears at the end of the poem and wants to give me money because she thinks I'm an idiot, that's funny. You know, and that's the other thing about traveling, right? That when you're in the world, reality can be funny. It can be tragic, but it can also be funny, right?
Yeah, and that can occupy your mind for the days to come, because you don't know what prompted this action, or
Yeah.
whether you invited that action in some way.
Yeah,
because,
that's right.
Because what you read out in that poem, you know, some of us have also experienced similar experiences here in India. I mean, I remember I was standing for my bus, waiting for the bus to come, and somebody actually handed me 10 rupee note in my hand, thinking, you know, I'm waiting for that.
Yeah. No, that it happens all the time, you know.
Yeah, so I mean, it's the human reaction, probably, the thing that this is what one is waiting for, and not for the one that you want to tell them about.
Auto walas refusing to take the fare.
Yeah. Because they think that they are completing their divine, you know, providence. They're actually doing something great. So when you were reading that poem, it also kind of resonated with many of us, I'm sure. Yeah,
that's right. And you know what? It's also true that if you're blind or visually impaired, you imagine what cities look like.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what I'm doing in that poem. I'm putting cities together in my mind just for fun.
Yeah.
You know, trying to create a utopian kind of fairy tale city, you know, part Mumbai, part Kyoto, you know, that's a fun thing to be doing. And she comes along and thinks I'm a object of pity. By the way, I took her money and then I gave it to somebody else.
Yeah. I also took that money and gave it to somebody else. Yeah, true. Someone who helped me catch a train, I gave it to that person.
Yeah, exactly. I was once in the old Soviet Union, and a guy wanted to sell me his coat. Okay, he needed money and he wanted, you know, he saw that I was a foreigner and he wanted to sell me his coat. And this is like something out of a Gogol story, you know. So I let him sell me his coat, and I gave him the money, and then I gave him his coat back. You know, I said, now you have your coat and the money. This is good.
Yeah.
Anurima? Yeah, we have another question from Kostav.
Okay.
Sir, your presentation is both poetic and precise, and it took me through several imaginary journeys as you delineated on the proleptic imaginary space. It's a very unique way of viewing disability, and I thought of romantic poetry, especially with regard to individual worth in a world where society consistently breaks us down.
Yes.
The idea of the flaneur, the travelogue writing, but all connected to disability. I liked specifically how you did not equate this idea with a leisurely activity, but I'm wondering how it would apply to someone with multiple disabilities.
Right.
All in all, it was really inspiring listening to you. I have a cousin who is visually impaired and also has autism, and traveling is seen as a nightmare for him
Yes.
by others, and he honestly finds it difficult too.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Well, so one thing that I'm guilty of is that I present my version of the blind traveler as a solo traveler. And that is a wonderful thing, to be independent and able to go places. That is a wonderful thing. And that's what I'm talking about in relation to Borges, who never learned how to go someplace on his own. But I also believe, this is a great question. I also believe that the concept of independence is often wrong, because independence is this idea, especially in the United States, but I'm sure it exists in India too. The idea that to be a successful human being, you must be independent.
Yeah.
We have this term in America, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You know, this is that Ronald Reagan nonsense that you're a self-made man. You know, you're an independent cowboy. You make it with the sweat of your own brow. You know, that in other words, to need help, to need a community, to need other people is seen as weakness. And, you know, I'm trying to prove the point that disability travel can be really profound and wonderful. But if you have multiple disabilities and you need some people to go with you, that can be a beautiful thing. Because we nurture each other and we strengthen each other. And I mean, here's a way to think about it. So I have this wonderful guide dog and I can go places with her. But people trained that dog. People raised that dog. It took a whole village, right? So my independence is not a kind of pure abstraction. It's connected to a whole group of wonderful people. So if you have multiple disabilities and you need to have a little bit of help to get out in the world, why not? The world will still reward you with its wonders and its surprises. Does that make sense?
I think Kaustav has also added to that. He's written, I'm reminded of Leonard Davis's idea of this modernism. We are all incomplete without each other's support, and especially in a world where we are really disabled, if I may say, without technology.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great comment. These comments are also good.
Anvesha has also written, extremely riveting session. Many thanks.
Oh, good. Good.
Any questions there? I mean, that one wants to unmute. In the meanwhile, it's an opportunity, while there are no questions, to ask Professor Steve one of my questions, just kind of connecting to what Kaustav was asking and to what you replied. I mean, my sense is that even if you travel with somebody, you could still be traveling with your own self, is my sense. I mean,
yes.
if you're sitting at a place by the sea or by the in the park, even if you have somebody around you, you could still snatch your time and make a sense of that place. So while one is with you, it need not always be the case that you can't find your own time. So so I was thinking while you were answering, Professor Steve, about having companions on travel. So do you think that therefore you're being a little hard on Borges for having someone along? Well, how would you see that?
You can't see me, I'm smiling. Yes, I'm being a little hard on Borges.
Yeah.
But Borges traveled the world, and he went all kinds of places, and he saw all kinds of things, with his companions, and he had a rich and fascinating life. And I wouldn't deny that for a minute. But the one thing he never did is to just simply get lost in a place
Okay.
and then kind of experience that as an imaginative moment, right?
Yeah.
And that's a kind of blind problem solving and a kind of blind art project. It's an art project.
Art project, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he didn't experience that. And that makes me a little sad for him.
Yeah. While one would think one could be envious of him, but yeah, I understand why you feel sad for him, because we've all got lost and we've all learned and we've all evolved. So why shouldn't he?
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I've gone to cities and I've gotten on a train and I've gotten off at the wrong stop and I've been in a strange place. And I always find that kind of wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You talk to people, you have interesting experiences, then you just get back on the next train, but
yeah.
Things happen.
That has happened to many of us also, Professor Steve. Once it happened, I overslept in a train and I got down to the next station. I missed my stations by 2. And I got down on the 3rd station and I didn't know whether the connecting train is even available from this station. So, and then one had to struggle and one had to figure and one had to somehow get back. So I completely agree with you that it's an art to kind of get back.
There's also a way in which in the modern world or the postmodern world, we're all directed to be, the servants of our Apple watches and our the clock. We're all supposed to be hurrying and hurrying and hurrying and hurrying, get here, get here, get here, get here. And yet when you get a little lost, time slows down.
Yeah.
And that's interesting too, right? So, but you're right. I'm being a little hard on Borges.
I just wanted to check on that. Yeah. Any more questions?
No, Sandeep, I can't see any more questions. No raised hands.
All right. So this is a good time for me to say thank you to Professor Steve Kuusisto. Again, as I said, we've all enjoyed and we're all kind of, reminiscing the talk that we've had from you. And I think people are just, all of the listeners are just, I think, seeping it all in, because it was so meditative, so imaginative, and so, enjoyable that I think we will think about these things for some time to come. So thank you, Professor Steve Kuusisto, for joining us.
I will happily send you the text. So
yes, it'll be amazing if you could.
You could put it on if you have a website or something,
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
So thank you very much for joining in as early as, I don't know what time it is where you are, but thank you. Very early, I guess, morning, you could join us and give us this amazing plenary session. So thank you to you. Thank you to Anurima and to our 2 sign language interpreters who've been doing great job through this conference. And last but not the least, to our listeners, the participants, for being here and listening to Professor Kuusisto's amazing plenary session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Yeah, bye. Thank you, Anurima.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.